Natalie Whitmore had hired 17 bodyguards in the past 2 years, firing each one for the same reason. They treated her like a precious ornament instead of a person. But when Alexander Kane walked into her penthouse with eyes like steel and a presence that commanded attention, she realized this one was going to be different. She just had no idea how different. Natalie Whitmore stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan penthouse, watching the city bustle below while internally rehearsing the dismissal speech she would deliver to her new bodyguard. At 25, she was the sole heir to the Whitmore pharmaceutical fortune, worth approximately $800 million, and she had never wanted protection less than she did at this moment. The threats had been escalating for months. Angry letters from families who blamed Whitmore, pharmaceuticals for loved ones lost to drug side effects, suspicious individuals photographing her apartment building, a recent break-in at her office that had left her father's security team rattled enough to insist on round-the-clock protection. Natalie found the whole situation insufferable. She had grown up with bodyguards, nannies and handlers who treated her like a delicate flower that might wilt under direct sunlight. Every spontaneous decision had to be cleared through security protocols. Every friendship was scrutinized for ulterior motives. Every romantic relationship had been poisoned by the question of whether her suitors loved her or her bank account. The previous 17 bodyguards had all been variations on the same theme: overly protective, condescendingly polite, and absolutely determined to keep her locked away from anything resembling a normal life. She had fired them for various infractions: breathing too loudly, wearing cologne she disliked, referring to her as Miss instead of by her name, and in one memorable case, for eating a sandwich that smelled like tuna fish. Her father's head of security had grown increasingly frustrated with her revolving door of protection details, but Natalie refused to compromise on this. If she was going to be followed around by a stranger whose job was to keep her alive, she was at least going to choose someone she could tolerate. The intercom buzzed, interrupting her mental preparation for what she assumed would be another disappointing interview. "Miss Whitmore," came the voice of her assistant. "Your new security specialist is here." "Send him up," Natalie replied with a sigh, already composing the polite but firm rejection she would deliver after a perfunctory meeting. When the elevator doors opened 5 minutes later, Natalie turned from the window expecting to see another hulking ex-military type in an ill-fitting suit. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who seemed to have stepped out of her most vivid dreams and into her carefully controlled reality. Alexander Kane was tall without being imposing, lean without being thin, with dark hair that looked like he had run his fingers through it and didn't care if it was perfectly styled. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. Deep blue, intelligent and focused on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit that had clearly been tailored to accommodate both his athletic build and whatever weapons he undoubtedly carried. Everything about him spoke of competence and danger held carefully in check, like a thoroughbred racehorse that was perfectly trained but capable of tremendous power when released. "Miss Whitmore?" he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't identify. "I'm Alexander Kane. I'll be handling your security going forward." Natalie blinked, momentarily thrown off her prepared script by the unexpected reality of this man who didn't match any of her preconceived expectations. "Mr. Kane," she began, forcing her voice to remain steady and professional, "I appreciate you coming, but I should tell you up front that I'm very particular about my security arrangements. I've had some incompatibility issues with previous personnel." Alexander's mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile, though it was gone so quickly Natalie couldn't be sure. "I'm aware of your employment history with protection specialists, Miss Whitmore. 17 and 24 months, if the reports are accurate." The fact that he had done his homework should have annoyed her, but instead, Natalie found herself curious about what else he might know. "And yet you still took the assignment?" "I don't consider challenges to be obstacles, Miss Whitmore. I consider them opportunities to excel." There was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning Natalie didn't understand, a confidence that went beyond professional competence into something more personal and determined. "What makes you think you'll be different from the others?" she asked, crossing her arms and studying his face for signs of the patronizing attitude that had driven her to dismiss his predecessors. "Because I'm not here to control your life," Alexander replied, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I'm here to protect it so you can live it however you choose." The words hit Natalie unexpectedly, cutting through her defensive posture to something deeper. No one had ever framed her security needs in terms of freedom rather than restriction. "That sounds good in theory," she said carefully. "But in practice, every bodyguard I've ever had has turned into a glorified prison warden." "Then they weren't doing their job correctly." Alexander took a step closer, and Natalie caught a hint of his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made her want to lean in rather than back away. "My job is to eliminate threats while being invisible to your daily life. You should barely notice I'm there." Natalie studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance or false promises she had come to expect. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like sincerity, though it was mixed with an intensity that made her pulse race in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. Against her better judgment, she heard herself saying, "We'll try it for a week. But I have rules." Alexander's smile was quick and genuinely amused. "I would expect nothing less from someone who managed to fire 17 trained professionals in 2 years. Natalie had no idea she had just hired the one man in the world who was more dangerous to her heart than any assassin could ever be to her life. The first surprise came the next morning, when Natalie woke to find that Alexander had somehow managed to conduct a complete security sweep of her penthouse, update her building's access protocols, and coordinate with her driver's schedule without disturbing her sleep or leaving any evidence of his presence, except a single white rose on her kitchen counter. The rose was perfect. Not too fragrant, not too large, clearly expensive, but not ostentatious. There was no note, no explanation, just a single flower that somehow managed to be both thoughtful and mysterious. Natalie stared at it while drinking her morning coffee, trying to determine whether she was annoyed or charmed by the gesture. None of her previous bodyguards had ever left her flowers. Most of them had treated her apartment like a crime scene to be secured, rather than a home to be respected. Alexander appeared in her doorway at exactly 8:30, dressed in a perfectly fitted black suit that somehow managed to be both professional and subtly elegant. He looked like he had slept well and spent considerable time on his appearance, though nothing about his grooming seemed excessive or vain. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying that same slight accent that made ordinary words sound more interesting. "Your car is ready when you are." Natalie had planned to test his patience by taking an extra 30 minutes with her morning routine, but something about his calm confidence made her want to be punctual instead. She found herself hurrying to finish her breakfast and gather her things for the day. The ride to her office provided the second surprise of the day. Instead of sitting in oppressive silence like her previous bodyguards, or attempting awkward small talk about the weather, Alexander seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts about the city, her work, and her plans for the day. "The Whitmore Foundation Gala is next week," Natalie mentioned as they navigated morning traffic. "It's our biggest fundraising event of the year. 500 guests, live auction, extensive media coverage. Previous security teams have always treated it like a military operation." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "Public events present unique challenges, but they're also opportunities to demonstrate that security can be elegant rather than intrusive. What matters most to you about the evening?" The question caught Natalie off guard. No bodyguard had ever asked what mattered. To her, beyond staying alive, "I want people to focus on the cause we're supporting, rather than wondering why I have armed guards stationed around the room like Secret Service agents," she admitted. "The foundation supports pediatric cancer research. The children and families we help shouldn't have to feel like they're attending a military briefing." "Then we'll make sure security is invisible," Alexander said simply, as if transforming a high-risk public event into something elegant and comfortable was a minor logistical detail. Throughout the day, Alexander proved to be unlike any bodyguard Natalie had ever worked with. He anticipated her needs without being intrusive, provided security without making her feel imprisoned, and somehow managed to fade into the background. While still being immediately available whenever she needed him, he was also impossible to ignore. There was something magnetic about Alexander that went beyond his obvious physical appeal. The way he moved through spaces suggested someone accustomed to command but comfortable with service. His attention to detail was extraordinary. He noticed everything from changes in her mood to potential security risks that her previous guards had missed entirely. But it was the small gestures that began to wear down Natalie's defenses. A perfectly prepared cup of coffee appeared on her desk exactly when she needed it. Her favorite lunch from a restaurant across town was delivered without her having to ask. When she mentioned being cold during a long meeting, a cashmere wrap somehow materialized draped over her chair. Each gesture was subtle enough to seem like coincidence, thoughtful enough to feel personal, and perfectly timed to be genuinely helpful rather than intrusive. By the end of the first week, Natalie realized that Alexander had accomplished something none of his predecessors had managed. He had made her feel safer without making her feel trapped. How do you do it? She asked him as they rode back to her apartment after a particularly long day of meetings. Do what, Miss Whitmore? Make security feel like freedom instead of imprisonment. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes reflecting the city lights streaming past their car windows. Because the goal isn't to control your environment, Miss Whitmore. It's to eliminate the things that would prevent you from being who you're meant to be. The words seemed to carry weight beyond their obvious meaning, as if Alexander was speaking about something more personal than professional security protocols. And who do you think I'm meant to be? Natalie heard herself asking. Alexander turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Someone extraordinary who hasn't been allowed to discover just how extraordinary she really is. Natalie was beginning to realize that Alexander saw something in her that she had never seen in herself, and it terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. Alexander's campaign to win Natalie's trust intensified over the following weeks with a precision that would have impressed military strategists. Every gesture was perfectly calculated to appeal to her specific needs and desires, every conversation designed to reveal new layers of his character, while drawing out aspects of hers that had been hidden for years. He learned her preferences with an attention to detail that bordered on supernatural. Her favorite flowers began appearing in her office, not just the white roses that had become his signature, but exotic orchids, rare peonies, seasonal blooms that somehow always matched her mood or the color of her outfit. Her favorite coffee shop, 20 blocks from her office, somehow began delivering her usual order at exactly the right moment each day. The obscure classical music she loved played softly in her car during their daily commutes. Books she had mentioned wanting to read appeared on her desk, always first editions, always perfectly pristine. But it was the bigger gestures that began to crack the walls around Natalie's heart. When she mentioned missing her college art classes during a particularly stressful week, Alexander arranged for a private studio space in her building, complete with easels, paints, and all the supplies she could want. When she expressed frustration about never having time to visit the small museum she loved, he somehow restructured her schedule to include cultural excursions that felt spontaneous, but were clearly carefully planned. Most impressively, when Natalie complained about feeling disconnected from the Foundation's work, Alexander coordinated a series of hospital visits that allowed her to meet the children her philanthropy supported. These visits were arranged with such discretion and security that Natalie felt like a normal person, rather than a wealthy donor making a publicity appearance. "How did you know?" she asked him after spending an afternoon playing board games with pediatric cancer patients, feeling more fulfilled than she had in months. "Know what, Miss Whitmore? That I needed to see the faces behind the statistics. That I needed to remember why the Foundation matters beyond tax write-offs and charity galas." Alexander's expression was serious, almost tender, because you care more than you allow yourself to show. It seemed logical that connecting with your purpose would make you happy. Natalie stared at him, struck by the realization that Alexander paid attention, not just to her security needs but to her emotional well-being with an intensity that felt both professional and deeply personal. The attention was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Alexander's physical presence became a constant that Natalie found herself depending on in ways she had never expected. He was always exactly where she needed him to be. close enough to provide security but far enough away to give her space. His energy filled rooms in ways that made her feel more confident, more attractive, more interesting than she had ever felt before. But it was during the foundation gala that Natalie realized just how thoroughly Alexander had infiltrated her defenses. The event was flawless in ways that previous galas had never been. Security was invisible but comprehensive. The evening flowed smoothly without any of the awkward moments that usually occurred when her protection detail interfered with social interactions. Guests commented on how relaxed and radiant she looked. How natural and engaging her speeches were. Alexander had somehow managed to create an environment where Natalie could be her best self without compromising her safety. "You're staring," her best friend Madison observed during a quiet moment between auction items. "What?" Natalie blinked, realizing she had been watching. Alexander coordinates security details with the subtle grace of a conductor leading an orchestra. "You're staring at your bodyguard, like he's the most fascinating person in the room," Madison said with a knowing smile. "Which, let's be honest, he probably is. Where did you find him? He's nothing like the others." Natalie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's just competent." "Honey, competent is making sure you don't get shot. That man is making you glow. There's a difference." Before Natalie could protest, Alexander appeared at her elbow with perfect timing, as if he had sensed she might need him. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "the auction coordinator needs your approval on the final lot presentation." As they walked toward the stage together, Natalie was acutely aware of Alexander's presence beside her. The way he moved with controlled grace, the way other people instinctively stepped aside to let them pass, the way his attention seemed focused entirely on her, even while monitoring the room for potential threats. "Thank you," she said impulsively as they reached the side of the stage. "For what, Miss Whitmore?" "For making tonight perfect. For understanding what I needed without making me ask for it. For treating this like it mattered instead of just another security assignment." Alexander's expression shifted, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal something deeper and more personal underneath. "Everything about you matters, Natalie. More than you realize." The use of her first name sent electricity through her system. Alexander had maintained perfect professional boundaries for weeks, never crossing the line into familiarity or intimacy. Hearing her name and his voice, spoken with such quiet intensity, felt like a confession and a promise rolled into one. "Alexander," she began, but he had already stepped back, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. "The auction coordinator is waiting." "Miss Whitmore." Natalie was falling for a man whose job was to protect her life, but she was beginning to suspect he was the greatest danger to her heart. The shift in their relationship began subtly, like ice beginning to crack under spring sunshine. Natalie found herself looking forward to her daily interactions with Alexander in ways that went far beyond professional necessity. She began choosing outfits that would catch his attention, planning conversations that would reveal more about his thoughts and background, creating excuses to spend additional time in his presence. Alexander seemed to sense her growing interest and responded with an intensity that was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. His attention became more focused, his gestures more personal, his protection more thorough in ways that suggested he was guarding something precious rather than simply doing his job. The breakthrough came during a quiet evening in her penthouse, when Natalie was working late on foundation business and Alexander was conducting his nightly security checks. She had been struggling with a particularly complex grant application, growing increasingly frustrated with bureaucratic language and contradictory requirements. "Problems?" Alexander asked, appearing in the doorway of her home office with that uncanny timing that had become so familiar. "Just foundation paperwork," Natalie sighed, pushing back from her desk. "Sometimes I think we could help twice as many children if we could eliminate half the administrative requirements." Alexander moved into the room, and Natalie caught that subtle scent of his cologne that had become as comforting as it was distracting. "May I?" Natalie nodded, and Alexander settled into the chair across from her desk, his blue eyes scanning the documents with the same focused attention he brought to everything else. "The problem is in your approach," he said after a few minutes of reading. "You're trying to fit your vision into their framework. instead of demonstrating why their framework should expand to accommodate your vision. What do you mean? Alexander leaned forward, his enthusiasm for the subject evident in his voice and posture. You're not just asking for money to support existing programs. You're pioneering new approaches to pediatric care that could revolutionize treatment protocols. The application should emphasize innovation rather than compliance. For the next 2 hours, Alexander helped Natalie completely restructure her grant application, revealing a sophisticated understanding of nonprofit management, healthcare policy, and strategic communication that went far beyond what any bodyguard should possess. How do you know all this? Natalie asked as they finished polishing the final section. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his expression cycling through emotions she couldn't read. I've had experience with philanthropic organizations. Sometimes personal circumstances provide educational opportunities you wouldn't choose, but benefit from nonetheless. The careful phrasing suggested painful personal history, and Natalie found herself wanting to know more about the experiences that had shaped this extraordinary man. Was someone in your family sick? She asked gently. Alexander's smile was sad and brief. Something like that. The details aren't important, but the experience taught me that people with resources have obligations to those without them. What you're doing with the foundation, it matters in ways you probably don't fully understand. Natalie felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that Alexander understood her work not just intellectually, but emotionally. He saw the foundation as more than charity or tax strategy. He saw it as a calling, a responsibility, a way of honoring the privilege that came with inherited wealth. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for helping with the application, but for understanding why it matters. Alexander's gaze met hers across the desk, and Natalie felt the air between them change, becoming charged with possibilities and dangers she had been trying to avoid. Natalie, he said, her name spoken like a prayer. There are things about me you don't understand. Things that complicate— I don't care, Natalie interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. I don't care about complications or professional boundaries or whatever you think is standing between us. I care about you, about who you are when you forget to be my bodyguard and just be yourself. Alexander closed his eyes, as if her words caused him physical pain. You don't know who I really am. Then tell me, Natalie said, standing and moving around the desk to stand closer to him. Tell me who Alexander Kane really is beneath all the professional competence and mysterious backgrounds. Alexander opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression of such longing and conflict that Natalie felt her heart break a little. I'm someone who fell in love with you the moment I saw you, and who would do anything to be worthy of you, even if it means living a lie. The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Natalie stared at him, her heart racing with joy and terror in equal measure. Alexander, she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. But before her fingers could make contact, Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent security alert, shattering the moment and reminding them both of the complicated reality they were navigating. We need to go, Alexander said, his professional mask snapping back into place. Now. Just as Natalie was ready to surrender to love, the dangerous world they lived in was about to remind them both that some fairy tales come with life or death consequences. The attack came without warning during what should have been a routine visit to the children's hospital, where the foundation funded a new wing. Natalie had been reading to a group of young patients, surrounded by the kind of joy and laughter that made all her philanthropic work feel worthwhile, when Alexander's entire demeanor changed in the space of a heartbeat. She saw him touch his earpiece, his expression shifting from relaxed alertness to lethal focus. His eyes swept the room with systematic precision, cataloging exits, threats, and variables that Natalie couldn't see but trusted him to handle. We need to leave, he said quietly, moving to her side with fluid grace. Now. Natalie had learned to trust Alexander's instincts completely, so she began making polite excuses to the hospital staff without question. But as they moved through the corridors toward the exit, she could feel tension radiating from Alexander like heat from a fire. The first gunshot shattered the afternoon calm like a thunderclap. Alexander's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. He swept Natalie behind a concrete pillar while simultaneously drawing a weapon she hadn't known he was carrying, his movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. In the space of seconds, he had transformed from her thoughtful, gentle protector into something that looked more like a predator than a guardian. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Do not move until I tell you it's safe." What followed was the longest 3 minutes of Natalie's life. Alexander moved through the hospital corridors like a force of nature, eliminating threats with precision that spoke of training far beyond civilian security work. Natalie caught glimpses of him between the concrete pillars, spinning, firing, moving with deadly grace that was both terrifying and magnificent. When the silence finally returned, Alexander was back at her side, checking her for injuries with hands that trembled slightly despite his outward calm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion and adrenaline. "I'm fine," Natalie managed, though she wasn't sure that was entirely true. "Are they—" "3 shooters, all down," Alexander replied grimly. "Hospital security is handling the aftermath. We need to get you to a secure location." The ride to the safe house was silent, except for Alexander's quiet conversations with various law enforcement agencies and security personnel. Natalie found herself studying his profile, seeing him clearly for the first time since they had met. This was not a man who had learned combat skills from civilian security training. This was someone who had been raised for violence, shaped by it, perfected by it. The way he moved, the way he spoke to other professionals, the way he had handled a life-or-death situation with absolute competence, none of it was the result of ordinary preparation. "Who are you?" she asked quietly as they pulled up to a nondescript building in Queens. Alexander's hands stilled on the steering wheel. "I'm someone who would die before letting anything happen to you." "That's not an answer." Alexander turned to look at her, his blue eyes holding depths of conflict and longing that made her chest ache. "I know, and I promise I'll give you a real answer. But right now, I need to make sure you're safe." The safe house was Spartanly furnished but comfortable, clearly maintained for exactly these kinds of emergencies. Alexander conducted a thorough security sweep before allowing Natalie to settle on the couch, his professionalism warring with obvious concern for her emotional state. "How did they find me?" Natalie asked as Alexander finished checking windows and exits. "We're still investigating," Alexander replied, settling into a chair across from her. "But this wasn't random. Someone with resources and planning capability wanted to hurt you specifically." Natalie absorbed this information, trying to process the reality that someone had tried to kill her, that her life was in danger in ways she had never fully understood despite months of security briefings. "Alexander," she said quietly, "I need you to tell me the truth. About who you are, about how you can do the things I just saw you do, about why you're really here." Alexander closed his eyes, his internal struggle playing across his features like a storm passing over landscape. When he opened his eyes again, Natalie saw resignation mixed with something that looked like relief. "My name is Alexander Drakovich," he began, his voice carrying a weight of history and responsibility that his assumed name had never held. "I am the Crown Prince of Valdoria, a small kingdom in the Balkans. And I have been lying to you since the moment we met." The confession hit Natalie like a physical blow. "What?" "I saw you at a charity function in London 6 months ago," Alexander continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them all out before he lost his courage. "You were giving a speech about pediatric healthcare access, and you were the most beautiful, passionate, intelligent woman I had ever seen. I fell in love with you in that moment, completely and irrevocably." Natalie stared at him, her world tilting sideways as everything she thought she knew rearranged itself into patterns she couldn't comprehend. "I researched your security situation and discovered the threats against you were escalating," Alexander went on. "I used my resources and connections to position myself as your bodyguard because it was the only way I could be close to you, the only way I could protect you and court you simultaneously." "Court me?" Natalie's voice was barely above a whisper. Alexander's smile was sad and beautiful, and full of desperate love. "I want you to be my queen, Natalie. I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you, supporting your work, helping you change the world in all the ways you're meant to change it. But I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I am." The room fell silent except for the sound of Natalie's heart breaking and remaking itself, simultaneously. The man she loved was a prince who had lied to her about everything, except the way he looked at her like she was his entire world. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that grew wider with each passing second. Natalie stared at Alexander, Crown Prince Alexander, her mind corrected with bitter precision, trying to reconcile the man she had fallen in love with, and the stranger who had just confessed to months of elaborate deception. "A prince," she said finally, her voice flat and emotionless. "You're actually a prince." "Yes." Alexander's voice was quiet, careful, as if he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "And you've been lying to me since the day we met." "Yes." Natalie stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the city skyline without really seeing it. Her mind was racing through every interaction they had shared, every gesture that had seemed so thoughtful and personal, recontextualizing them through the lens of his deception. The flowers, the coffee, the way you anticipated everything I needed. That wasn't you being an exceptional bodyguard. That was you conducting some kind of elaborate royal courtship ritual. "It was me falling in love with you," Alexander said quietly. "Everything I did, every gesture, every moment we shared. Those feelings were real, Natalie. The circumstances might have been manufactured, but what I feel for you is the most genuine thing in my life." Natalie whirled around to face him, anger and hurt warring for dominance in her expression. "How can you say that when everything about us has been based on lies? You don't even know who I really am because you've been too busy playing a character to see me as a real person. That's not true." Alexander stood, taking a step toward her before stopping when he saw her retreat. "I know that you take your coffee with cream but no sugar. I know that you hum Vivaldi when you're concentrating on something challenging. I know that you cry at children's hospital visits because their courage breaks your heart in the most beautiful way." "Those are observations," Natalie shot back, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "Those are things anyone could learn by watching me closely enough. You don't know my dreams or my fears or what I want from life because you've been too busy manipulating me to actually care about my real feelings." Alexander's face crumpled as if she had struck him. "Natalie, please. Let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you decided I was some kind of prize to be won. How you thought the best way to court me was to lie about your entire identity. How you manipulated me into trusting you, into caring about you, into falling in love with someone who doesn't even exist." "I exist," Alexander said desperately. "Everything you fell in love with, everything that matters about who I am, that's real. The title, the kingdom, the circumstances of how we met, those are just details." Natalie laughed, a sound that was more sob than humor. "Just details? Alexander, you're a prince. You have responsibilities, subjects, a country that depends on you. I'm not some detail you can fit into your royal schedule when it's convenient." "You're not a detail," Alexander said fiercely. "You're everything. You're the reason I would give up the crown if necessary, the reason I would choose exile over living without you." "Don't you dare," Natalie whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare make me responsible for choices you should never have to make. Don't make me the villain in your fairy tale because I can't trust a man who spent months lying to me about who he is." Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but Natalie held up her hand to stop him. "I need you to leave," she said quietly. "I need you to go back to whatever royal duties you've been neglecting to play bodyguard. And I need time to figure out who I am when I'm not being manipulated by someone who thinks love is a game to be won through strategy and deception. Natalie, please." The word came out as a broken whisper. "Please just go." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through desperation, heartbreak, and finally, resigned acceptance. "If that's what you need, I'll go. But this isn't over, Natalie. What we have isn't something that can be destroyed by circumstances or poor choices. I'll find a way to prove to you that my love is real. Even if everything else was complicated, your love might be real," Natalie said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "But I don't know if I can ever trust it. And without trust, Love is just another beautiful lie. Alexander moved toward the door, pausing only to look back at her one final time. I love you, Natalie Whitmore. That's the most honest thing I've ever said to anyone, and I'm going to spend however long it takes proving that to you. After he left, Natalie collapsed onto the couch and cried until she had no tears left, mourning not just the loss of the man she loved, but the loss of the woman she had been becoming in his presence, confident, radiant, and finally ready to believe in fairy tales. Alexander had walked out of her life as a bodyguard, but Natalie had no idea he was about to walk back in as a prince determined to win her heart all over again. Three weeks passed before Natalie saw Alexander again. 3 weeks during which she discovered that heartbreak was not a dramatic emotion, but a dull, constant ache that colored every moment of every day. Her new bodyguard was competent and professional, and absolutely nothing like the man she was trying to forget. She threw herself into foundation work, doubled her hospital visits, and accepted every social invitation she received in a desperate attempt to fill the Alexander-shaped hole in her life. None of it worked. The first sighting came at the Metropolitan Museum of Art during a private donor reception for their new children's education wing. Natalie was discussing funding opportunities with the museum director when she felt the familiar prickle of awareness that had always accompanied Alexander's presence. She turned and saw him across the crowded gallery. But this Alexander was transformed. Gone was the perfectly tailored black suit of her bodyguard. Instead, he wore formal dress that spoke of royal protocol and state occasions, a perfectly fitted military-style jacket decorated with medals and insignia she didn't recognize, formal trousers, and the kind of bearing that commanded attention from everyone in the room. He was accompanied by an entourage that screamed diplomatic importance. Serious men in expensive suits who were clearly security personnel, elegant women who moved with the practiced grace of courtiers, and an older man, whose bearing suggested he was someone accustomed to speaking for royalty. Natalie watched from across the room as Alexander was introduced to museum board members and major donors, his public persona polished and charming in ways that were both familiar and entirely foreign. This was Prince Alexander Drakovich of Valdoria, and he commanded attention and respect in ways that Alexander Kane, the bodyguard, never could have managed. But when their eyes met across the crowded gallery, all the royal protocol in the world couldn't hide the desperate longing in his gaze. Natalie excused herself from her conversation and fled to the ladies' room, her heart racing with a mixture of anger and longing that she had been trying to suppress for weeks. When she emerged, Alexander was waiting in the corridor, having somehow managed to escape his diplomatic handlers. Natalie, her name spoken in his familiar voice, made her chest tighten with emotions she had been trying to bury. Your Highness, she replied formally, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her heart. Alexander winced as if she had struck him. Please don't, not you. Never you. What are you doing here? Natalie asked, crossing her arms defensively. The museum invited Valdoria to sponsor their children's educational initiatives, Alexander replied. It seemed like something you would support. Natalie stared at him, realizing the implications. You arranged this. You used your royal connections to put yourself in my path. I used my resources to support a cause you care about, Alexander corrected. The fact that it brings me closer to you is a secondary benefit. Secondary? Natalie laughed bitterly. Alexander, you're sponsoring children's programs because you think it will impress me. That's not secondary. That's manipulation. It's desperation, Alexander said quietly, his royal composure cracking to reveal the man she had fallen in love with. It's a man who realizes he made the worst mistake of his life and is willing to do anything to fix it. Before Natalie could respond, one of Alexander's handlers appeared in the corridor, speaking in rapid, urgent tones in a language she didn't recognize. Alexander responded in the same language, his tone carrying unmistakable authority before turning back to Natalie. I have to go, he said regretfully. But Natalie, this isn't over. I meant what I said. I'll find a way to prove that what we had was real. The second encounter came a week later at Lincoln Center during a gala performance benefiting pediatric cancer research. Natalie had bought a table for the foundation, planning to use the evening to network with other philanthropists. and forget about royal princes with blue eyes and secret agendas. She was seated in the orchestra section when a murmur rippled through the audience. Turning toward the royal box, she saw Alexander again, this time in formal evening wear that made him look like he had stepped out of a fairy tale. He was accompanied by what appeared to be a state delegation, all formal protocol and diplomatic importance. But throughout the entire performance, Natalie could feel his attention focused on her like a spotlight. During intermission, a waiter appeared at Natalie's table with a single white rose and a note written in Alexander's familiar handwriting. For the woman who taught me that some dreams are worth any sacrifice. Natalie stared at the note, her heart racing with memories of all the flowers he had left for her. All the small gestures that had seemed so thoughtful before she learned they were part of an elaborate royal courtship campaign. Secret admirer? Asked her tablemate, a prominent socialite with a keen interest in gossip. Something like that, Natalie murmured, tucking the note into her purse, where it seemed to burn against her fingers like evidence of her own weakness. The third encounter was the most devastating. Natalie was visiting the children's hospital where she had been attacked, reading to the same group of young patients who had become some of her favorite people in the world. She was in the middle of a story about brave princesses and noble quests when she looked up to see Alexander standing in the doorway. But this time he wasn't dressed in royal finery or diplomatic protocol. He was wearing simple jeans and a sweater, looking exactly like the man she had fallen in love with, and he was carrying an enormous box of art supplies. "Sorry I'm late," he said to the head nurse as if he belonged there. "I brought the painting supplies we discussed for the new art therapy program." Natalie watched in shock as Alexander began distributing art materials to the children. His interactions natural and genuinely caring in ways that had nothing to do with royal duty or diplomatic obligations. The children responded to him immediately, drawn by the same magnetic warmth that had first captured Natalie's attention. "Prince Alexander has been funding our new art therapy wing," the head nurse explained quietly to Natalie. "He's been working with our staff for weeks to design a program that will help children process their medical experiences through creative expression." Natalie felt her carefully. Constructed defenses begin to crumble as she watched Alexander help a young girl with leukemia paint a picture of her dreams. His attention was completely focused on the child, his conversation genuine and encouraging, his presence bringing light to a room that dealt with too much darkness. This wasn't manipulation or royal protocol. This was the man she had fallen in love with, using his resources and position to make the world better for children who needed hope. "Why?" she asked him quietly when the session ended and the children had been taken back to their rooms. Alexander looked at her with eyes that held months of longing and regret. "Because you taught me that privilege is only meaningful when it's used to help people who can't help themselves. Because supporting causes you care about feels like the closest I can get to supporting you, because I love you. And this is what love looks like when you can't be with the person who matters most." Natalie felt tears sting her eyes. "Alexander, I know you can't trust me," he said quietly. "I know I destroyed that when I lied to you about who I was, but I need you to know that every day since you sent me away, I've been trying to become worthy of the faith you had in me before you learned the truth." "It's not about being worthy," Natalie whispered. "It's about being honest. How can I believe anything you tell me when our entire relationship was built on deception?" Alexander stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell his familiar cologne, close enough that she had to fight the urge to reach for him. "Then judge me by my actions," he said quietly. "Judge me by what I do, not what I say. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that my love for you is the most honest thing about me." Natalie was beginning to realize that Alexander's actions spoke louder than his deceptions ever could, and her heart was starting to believe in second chances. The internal war between Natalie's wounded pride and her stubborn heart raged for another month, during which Alexander seemed to appear everywhere she went, not as an intrusion, but as a constant reminder of the man she was trying to forget and couldn't quite manage to stop loving. He was at the children's hospital every week, working with the art therapy program that bore his foundation's name, but not his personal involvement. He sponsored 3 more museum exhibitions that aligned with causes Natalie supported. He funded a pediatric research wing at Columbia Presbyterian that would advance exactly the kind of innovative treatments she had been advocating for years. But it was the letter that finally broke her resolve. It arrived on expensive royal stationery, delivered by diplomatic courier to her penthouse, on a gray Thursday morning when Natalie was feeling particularly sorry for herself and missing Alexander with an intensity that surprised her with its persistence. The letter was written in Alexander's careful handwriting, pages of elegant script that looked like it had taken hours to compose. Dearest Natalie, I have been trying to find the words to explain what you mean to me, but every language I speak seems inadequate for describing the way you changed my life simply by existing in it. I was raised to be a prince, trained from childhood to put duty above personal desires, to sacrifice individual happiness for the greater good of my country and my people. I accepted this as the natural order of my life until I saw you giving that speech in London about healthcare access for children who couldn't afford treatment. You stood on that stage talking about justice and compassion and the responsibility that comes with privilege, and I realized I had never met anyone who embodied those values so completely. You weren't talking about charity as a tax write-off or philanthropy as a social obligation. You were talking about love as an action, about using whatever advantages life gives you to make the world better for people who need hope. I fell in love with your passion first, then your intelligence, then the way you made everyone around you want to be better than they were. By the time I learned about the threats against you, I was already planning ways to meet you properly, to court you through appropriate diplomatic channels, to convince you that a small kingdom in the Balkans might be lucky enough to deserve a queen like you. But when I discovered that your life was in danger, all diplomatic protocol became irrelevant. I could not risk losing you to violence while I navigated the proper social procedures for royal courtship, so I lied about my identity, manipulated circumstances to become your protector, and fell more deeply in love with you every day while living the most elaborate deception of my life. I know that what I did was wrong. I know that deception, no matter how well-intentioned, is a betrayal of the trust that love requires. I know that you have every right to hate me for taking away your choice about who you wanted to love and how you wanted to be courted. But I need you to know that every moment we shared was real for me. Every conversation, every gesture, every time I made you laugh, or helped solve a problem, or simply stood near you while you worked, those weren't performances or manipulations. They were the most authentic experiences of my entire life. You asked me once who Alexander Kane really was beneath the professional competence and mysterious background. The truth is that Alexander Kane was who I became when I stopped trying to be a perfect prince and started trying to be a man worthy of your love. He was the version of myself that you inspired, the person I could be when I wasn't weighed down by crowns and protocols and the expectations of an entire country. I am still that man, Natalie. Underneath all the royal complications and diplomatic responsibilities, I am still the person who fell in love with your mind first, your heart second, and your beautiful smile third. I am still the man who would give up everything I was born to be for the chance to become everything you need me to be. I don't know if you can ever forgive me for the lies I told or trust me enough to build something real on the foundation of something that began with deception. But I need you to know that loving you taught me the difference between existing and living, between duty and purpose, between being a prince and being a man. If you can find it in your heart to give me another chance, I promise that every word I speak to you for the rest of our lives will be honest, even when the truth is complicated or difficult or reveals weaknesses I would prefer to hide. If you cannot forgive me, I will respect your choice and find ways to love you from a distance that doesn't cause you pain. But I will never stop loving you, never stop being grateful that you existed in my world long enough to show me what I was missing, never stop believing that what we had was worth every risk I took to find it. With all my love and endless devotion, Alexander P.S., I am resigning my position as Crown Prince and renouncing my claim to the throne. My younger sister will make a far better ruler than I ever could have been, and I have discovered that I would rather be a commoner who deserves your love than a prince who lives without it. Natalie read the letter 3 times before the full implications of his postscript hit her like a physical blow. He was giving up his kingdom for her because of her rejection of him. The realization sent her into a panic that surprised her with its intensity. Alexander was sacrificing everything he had been born to be, everything he had been trained for, everything his country needed from him. and it was her fault for not being able to forgive him for loving her enough to lie. She was dressed and out of her apartment within minutes, driven by a certainty that felt like the most important revelation of her life. She found Alexander at the Valdorian consulate, in a meeting with what appeared to be very serious diplomatic officials who were speaking in urgent, concerned tones about constitutional crises and succession protocols. When Natalie walked into the conference room without being announced, every conversation stopped. "I need to speak with you," she said. Her eyes locked on Alexander's face. "Now." Alexander stared at her for a moment, as if he couldn't believe she was real, then said something in rapid Valdorian to the assembled officials. They filed out of the room with obvious reluctance, leaving Natalie and Alexander, alone with years of hurt and hope and desperate love, stretched between them like a bridge neither had been brave enough to cross. "You can't give up your crown," Natalie said without preamble. "I already have," Alexander replied quietly. "The paperwork was filed this morning." "Then unfile it," Natalie said desperately. "Alexander, you can't sacrifice your entire country because I was too hurt and stubborn to forgive you for falling in love with me in a complicated way." Alexander's smile was sad and beautiful. "I'm not sacrificing my country, Natalie. I'm choosing the life I want over the life I was born to live." "There's a difference." Natalie stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the man she had fallen in love with. Not the bodyguard, or the prince, but the person who existed in the space between those roles. The one who would risk everything for love and call it a privilege instead of a sacrifice. "I love you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I love you, and I forgive you, and I want to figure out how to build something real with you, even if it's complicated and messy, and requires learning entirely new rules for how love works between commoners and royalty." Alexander's expression shifted through disbelief, hope, and overwhelming joy in the space of a single heartbeat. "Natalie, I love who you were as my bodyguard, because that's who you became when you let yourself care about someone more than duty or protocol," Natalie continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I also love who you are as a prince because that's who you were raised to be, and your country needs you. And I won't be responsible for depriving an entire kingdom of the leader they deserve." Alexander moved toward her, stopping just close enough that she could see the tears in his own eyes. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Natalie took a deep breath, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff into the most terrifying and wonderful adventure of her life. "I'm saying that if the offer is still open, I would very much like to learn how to be a queen worthy of a king who would give up his crown for love." They had found their way back to each other, but learning to love as equals while ruling a kingdom was going to be their greatest adventure yet. 6 months later, Natalie stood in the gardens of the royal palace in Valdoria, watching Alexander address a crowd of citizens who had gathered to meet their future queen. The transformation in both of them had been remarkable to witness, and even more extraordinary to live through. Alexander had withdrawn his abdication papers within hours of Natalie's appearance at the consulate, but not before using the crisis to negotiate significant reforms in how the monarchy would operate going forward. The crown prince who returned to his duties was not the same man who had left to pursue a woman in New York. He was someone who had learned to balance duty with personal happiness, tradition with progress, royal protocol with genuine human connection. Natalie had thrown herself into learning everything required to become a modern queen, but she had insisted on doing it her way, instead of simply studying diplomatic protocol and state ceremony. She had focused on understanding how royal resources could be leveraged to address systemic problems. Her background in philanthropy had proven invaluable in reimagining how a small kingdom could have a large impact on issues she cared about. The Valdorian Royal Foundation, established jointly by Alexander and Natalie, had become a model for how inherited privilege could be transformed into meaningful social change. They had funded children's hospitals across the Balkans, established educational exchange programs with underdeveloped regions, and pioneered new approaches to environmental sustainability that were being studied by larger nations. But it was the personal transformation that had been most remarkable. Alexander had learned to integrate all the different aspects of his identity into someone who could be authentically himself while still fulfilling his royal obligations. The intensity and attention to detail that had made him an exceptional bodyguard now served him well as a king who genuinely cared about his people's welfare. The man who had fallen in love with Natalie's passion for justice had become a leader who could channel that same passion into effective governance. Natalie had discovered that love didn't require choosing between her independence and her relationship, but rather finding ways to be fully herself within a partnership that enhanced rather than diminished both people involved. She had not given up her foundation work to become a queen. She had expanded it to operate on an international scale. She had not sacrificed her identity to fit royal expectations. She had transformed those expectations to accommodate someone who believed queens should be activists rather than figureheads. "Are you ready?" Alexander asked, appearing at her side in the garden, where she had been gathering her thoughts before the ceremony. "I've been ready since the day I realized that loving you meant accepting all the complicated, wonderful, impossible parts of who you are," Natalie replied, turning to face the man who had taught her that fairy tales could be real if you were brave enough to write your own version. Alexander looked magnificent in his formal royal attire, but it was the expression in his blue eyes that made Natalie's heart race. The same intensity and devotion that had first captured her attention when he was pretending to be her bodyguard, now combined with the confidence of a man who had learned to be exactly who he was meant to be. "I love you, Queen Natalie," Alexander said, offering her his arm as they prepared to walk toward the ceremony that would formalize what had been true in their hearts for months. "I love you too, Your Majesty," Natalie replied, then smiled with the mischief that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. "Though I still think you could have just asked me out for coffee instead of staging an elaborate international deception." Alexander's laugh was rich and warm and full of the joy that had transformed both their lives. "Where would have been the fun in that?" As they walked toward the cathedral where representatives from dozens of countries waited to witness their wedding, Natalie marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had started as protector and protected, evolved into lovers navigating deception and betrayal, and emerged as partners ready to face whatever challenges came with ruling a kingdom, while remaining true to themselves and each other. The ceremony was beautiful in ways that honored both tradition and innovation, combining the pomp that Valdorian protocol required with personal touches that reflected who Alexander and Natalie really were. Instead of the usual royal wedding flowers, the cathedral was filled with white roses, Alexander's signature gesture from their courtship, now transformed into a symbol of how love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances. When Alexander slipped the queen's crown onto Natalie's head, she felt the weight of it not as a burden, but as a responsibility she was eager to embrace. This was not just a marriage, but a partnership in service, a joining of two people who had found in each other the perfect complement to their individual strengths and shared values. The archbishop stepped forward to conclude the ceremony, but Alexander held up his hand, his blue eyes locked on Natalie's face with an intensity that made her heart race. "Before we are presented as king and queen," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral, "I need to say something that I should have said honestly from the very beginning." The assembled crowd fell silent, sensing that they were about to witness something far more significant than royal protocol. Alexander took both of Natalie's hands in his voice strong and unwavering as he spoke words that came from the deepest part of his soul. "Natalie Whitmore, you are the reason I learned the difference between existing and living. You are the woman who taught me that true strength comes not from power or position, but from the courage to love someone completely, honestly, and without reservation. You saved me from a life of duty without purpose, privilege without meaning, and success without joy." Tears began streaming down Natalie's cheeks as Alexander's voice grew even more passionate and determined. "I love you with everything I am, and everything I will ever become. I love your fierce intelligence, your unwavering compassion, and the way you make everyone around you want to be better than they thought possible. I love how you challenge me to become worthy of you, how you refused to settle for anything less than complete honesty, and how you chose to forgive me even when I didn't deserve it." Alexander's voice broke slightly with the intensity of his emotion, but he continued with the determination of a man who had waited his entire life to speak these words. "I promise you that for the rest of our lives, I will love you as fiercely as I pursued you, protect you as devotedly as I courted you, and stand beside you as your equal partner in everything we build together. You are my heart, my queen, my everything, and loving you is the greatest honor of my life." The cathedral erupted in applause and cheers as Natalie stepped closer to Alexander, her own voice strong and clear despite her tears. "And I love you, Alexander Drakovich, with all the intensity you deserve and all the trust you've earned. You are my king, my partner, and my greatest adventure." Together, they turned to face their people, hand in hand, ready to rule a kingdom built on the foundation of a love that had survived deception, betrayal, and the ultimate test of choosing each other above all else. They had started their story with deception and secrets, but they would write their future with truth, trust, and the kind of love that transforms not just hearts, but entire kingdoms.